Few know about the most enigmatic episode in Moses' life, a moment that almost took him out of history before the Exodus even began. It was there, on a quiet night on the road, that a foreign woman stood between death and divine purpose. Her name was Zipporah. The Bible mentions her in a few lines, almost like a shadow that appears and disappears. But behind that silence, there is a gesture that saved not only a man, but God's promise to an entire people. While Moses faced a mysterious attack, described as an attempt by the Lord himself to kill him, it was Zippora who understood alone what was happening. She took a sharp stone, circumcised her son, and touched the blood on her husband's feet, uttering words that sealed a forgotten covenant. Subscribe to the channel and discover curiosities, hidden facts, and profound truths about the characters in the Bible. Turn on the bell and follow each new video. This act, done without instruction or warning, reveals something profound. Zippora knew the spiritual language of obedience. In an instant, she discerned what the chosen prophet had not understood. When Moses was vulnerable, she became the bridge between divine wrath and mercy. A foreign woman, raised outside the promises of Israel, was the one who reminded the deliverer of the covenant he had neglected. But who was this woman? Why was her reaction so precise, almost prophetic? And what led God to act so drastically against the very man he had called? These are questions that many readers ignore, but which conceal one of the most mysterious and theological scenes in the Old Testament. Zipporah thus emerges as a reminder that faith is not always found in grand speeches or supernatural visions. Sometimes it is found in the hands that act when everyone else is paralyzed. Her silent gesture was a turning point. After it, Moses was able to move forward to free Israel. Before it, the divine plan was about to come to an end. And it is from this scene, a woman, a rock, and an act of blood, that we begin to rediscover the hidden strength of Zipporah, the woman who saved Moses when no one else could. Before continuing, I want to invite you to comment on which city or country you are watching from. Let's see how far this message is reaching. At the time Zipporah met Moses, Egypt was the center of world power. Pyramids already dominated the horizon. The pharaoh was considered a living god, and Hebrew slavery sustained the glory of an empire that seemed eternal. The people of Israel lived under the weight of generations of imprisonment, awaiting an ancient promise, that of a God who would one day free them. Meanwhile, far from the banks of the Nile, the desert of Midian followed a completely different rhythm. There, herds dictated the weather, and winds sculpted the dry soil. Midian was not a military power, but a region marked by deep spiritual traditions. The Midianite people were descended from Abraham through his wife Keturah, and preserved a form of religious knowledge that blended ancient truths with tribal rites. In this setting, the priest Jethro, also called Reuel, was a respected figure, and his daughter Zipporah grew up among tents, altars, and ancestral songs. It was to this simple but spiritually charged world that Moses arrived, fleeing Egypt. He had killed an Egyptian and become an exile, a prince without a throne, a Hebrew without a nation. When he stopped by a well, the same symbol of divine encounters that had already marked the history of Rebekah and Rachel, his destiny began to change. Zipporah appeared there, among the shepherdesses, defended by an unknown man who barely knew the direction of his life. The contrast between the two worlds could not be greater. He, educated within the golden walls of Pharaoh; she, raised under the tents of the desert. But it is precisely in this contrast that God's plan began to take shape. Egypt represented human power, the strength of civilization. Midian, on the other hand, symbolized silence, the waiting period, the place where God shapes his chosen ones away from the spotlight. Zipporah grew up in an environment where women knew how to act with courage, and men sought spiritual wisdom more than political power. Moses, broken by his escape, found in Midian the learning he had not had in the palaces, the value of patience, family, and faith in the unseen. There, amid the desert dust and Zipporah's serene gaze, the future liberator began to be transformed, and God quietly prepared the meeting between destiny and promise. Zipporah was the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian, a man whose wisdom echoed throughout the tribes of the desert. Her name, which means bird, seemed to foreshadow a free spirit, ready to cross boundaries that most women of her time would never dare to cross. She grew up among tents and altars, listening to ancient stories about the God of Abraham, but also living with local rites, sacrifices, and symbols of a fragmented faith. Between the sound of the flocks and the silence of the starry nights, Zippora learned to discern the sacred in small things, and it was in this seemingly ordinary setting that she was preparing for an extraordinary destiny without knowing it. On the other side was Moses, a man torn between two identities, raised as an Egyptian prince, but with Hebrew blood running through his veins. His heart carried an emptiness that neither Pharaoh's temples nor the privileges of the court could fill. When he fled to the desert after killing an Egyptian, Moses carried guilt, fear, and an unfulfilled promise on his back. Their encounter was not only romantic, it was prophetic. By the well, a symbol of alliances and beginnings, Moses defended Zippora and her sisters from the shepherds who oppressed them. And that gesture, simple in human eyes, was the seed of a new phase in the divine plan. Jethro welcomed him, and Moses found in Zippora not only a companion, but a reflection of what he still needed to become, a gentle but strong soul, discreet but ready to act. The marriage between an exiled Hebrew and a Midianite woman seemed unlikely, but it carried a profound lesson. God was uniting two distinct lineages to prepare the future liberator. Zippora became a witness to the years of silence that preceded the call. While Moses tended sheep, she watched the transformation of a fugitive into a servant. The well where it all began gave way to the mountain where everything would change. In the desert, among the embers of the burning bush, the God of Israel's fathers called Moses, and indirectly called Zippora as well, because the destinies of both would be intertwined not only by love, but by purpose. If this content is touching your heart, you can support this project by donating any amount by clicking on the "Thanks a Lot" button. Your support helps me continue to tell these stories with dedication. Zipporah's life alongside Moses began in the silence of the desert, among flocks and dusty roads. At first glance, it was a simple existence, but behind the routine, there was an invisible tension. Moses was not like the other men of Midian. His gaze was often lost on the horizon, as if he carried within him a memory that would not leave him in peace. Zippora noticed this. She knew that her husband kept secrets that came from a strange world, Egypt, a place of stone gods, slaves, and palaces. In the early years, she had to learn to deal with this mystery. Moses was kind but introspective, hard-working but restless. He moved as if waiting for something that had not yet arrived. Zippora, accustomed to the clarity of Midianite traditions, faced the challenge of living with a man in constant transition. His faith was different, his past was distant, and his soul seemed divided between the desert and something greater than himself. While caring for her children and daily tasks, Zippora also faced the spiritual difference between them. Moses spoke of a single God, invisible, without image, without altar, something that contrasted with the rites and symbols of her family's faith. She did not fully understand him, but she respected the fervor she saw in his eyes, and discreetly, she began to observe her husband's God with curiosity and awe. That was when the first trials began. The scarcity, the long walks, the isolation of those who live far from their own culture. Every day Zippora learned to be more than a wife. She was a confidant, guardian, and emotional support to a man in the process of discovery. Even without understanding all of Moses' ways, she accompanied him loyally. But there was something deeper happening. God was shaping both of them, him to free a nation, her to save the liberator. The desert was the crucible where both their faith would be tested. And before the burning bush appeared, Zippora was already facing her first challenge, loving a man called to something even he did not yet understand. The desert seemed silent, but God was already at work. And soon, the call that would change Moses' story would also put Zipporah before the greatest test of her life. The night was dark, and the silence of the desert hid a supernatural tension. Moses walked with his family toward Egypt, obeying the voice that had echoed from the burning bush. The call was clear, to free the people of Israel from slavery, but the path, still shrouded in mystery, led him to one of the most enigmatic episodes in all of Scripture, the moment when God himself tried to kill him. The Bible describes the scene briefly, almost abruptly, but behind the few words lies a profound spiritual drama. Moses, the man chosen to be the deliverer, had neglected something essential: the circumcision of his son. That sign was the seal of the covenant between God and Abraham, the visible mark of belonging to the covenant people. Without it, the mission was spiritually compromised. While Moses struggled with an illness or invisible attack, perhaps overcome by fever and weakness, Zippora realized what was happening. No angel appeared, no voice from heaven explained the reason, and yet she understood. With almost instinctive courage, she took a sharp stone, performed the ritual, and in a bold gesture, touched the blood on Moses' feet. Her words echoed like a riddle. "You are to me a husband of blood." The scene is shrouded in mystery, but it reveals something grand. While the chosen prophet faltered, the foreign woman understood what God demanded. She was the bridge between justice and mercy, between human negligence and the fulfillment of the covenant. The blood that stained her hands became a symbol of obedience, and in that instant, divine wrath ceased. Moses was spared, and the mission could continue. But something had changed profoundly. He understood that God's call could not be taken lightly. It was a covenant that demanded holiness, even within his own home. Zipporah, for her part, experienced the weight of a sacred act. Her silent gesture forever marked the destiny of Israel, and paradoxically distanced her for a time from the husband she had saved. On that road between Midian and Egypt, the future of the Exodus passed through the hands of a woman, and the blood she shed that night was the same that sealed the beginning of liberation. After that mysterious night, silence returned to the camp. Moses was recovering, but something in him had changed. The man who had once walked only driven by his calling now also carried the weight of spiritual responsibility. Zipporah, who had seen death up close and faced the invisible, had become a witness to the power and seriousness of God's covenant. Her attitude was not just a gesture of desperation, it was a prophetic act. By performing the rite of circumcision, Zipporah reaffirmed the covenant that Moses had forgotten, and with that, she reopened the way to the promise. Israel's deliverance depended first and foremost on faithfulness to the covenant made with Abraham. The deliverer's mistake nearly compromised the plan, but God used a foreign woman to restore the connection. The episode, though brief in Scripture, became a quiet spiritual turning point. From then on, Moses would never be the same. The man who would return to Egypt to confront Pharaoh was no longer the uncertain fugitive from Midian. He was now the servant who knew the weight of blood and obedience. Zipporah, for her part, understood something that few would realize. God's call is not fulfilled only in great public acts, but also in hidden obedience, in gestures that no one sees. However, the consequences were not only spiritual. The text indicates that after this event, Zipporah and their children stayed behind, returning to Midian. Perhaps she was shaken. Perhaps Moses realized that the road to Egypt would be too dangerous for his family. Either way, a distance opened up between them, the silent price of the mission, but this separation serves a purpose. In isolation, Moses would learn to trust God entirely, and Zipporah, in his absence, would become a symbol of the quiet faith that sustains those who fulfill impossible calls. Both were transformed by that encounter with the sacred. He by the mercy he received, she by the courage to intervene. The blood shed that night not only saved a life, it sealed the beginning of a journey that would change history. and in the shadows of that mystery, Zippora remained the invisible guardian of the promise. After the circumcision episode, Zippora disappears from the biblical account like a shadow slowly receding from the spotlight. Moses continues on to Egypt, accompanied only by Aaron, while the woman who saved him remains outside the narrative, a silence that speaks much more than it seems. Some scholars suggest that Moses sent Zippora and their children back to Midian for safety. Others believe that the separation was the result of an emotional conflict, the weight of the calling, fear, or even the trauma of that bloody night. Whatever the reason, there is something deeply human about this separation. The pain of a woman who loved a man called by God, but who now had to surrender him to divine purpose. Zippora had been the hidden heroine of a miracle, but the price was isolation. The woman who acted with faith and courage receives no recognition, no applause, no place of prominence in history. The world forgets her. And it is in this oblivion that one of the deepest pains of Scripture lies, that of those who fulfill God's will and yet must deal with the silence of their own destiny. While Moses confronted Pharaoh and saw powerful signs in Egypt, Zippora probably gazed at the horizon of Midian, not knowing if her husband was still alive. Her heart was torn between love and fear, between longing and faith. The wife of the deliverer had, in a sense, become an exile from the very mission she had helped to sustain. This distance also reveals a spiritual dilemma. Moses needed to learn that God's call often hurts what is most dear. Zippora, on the other hand, needed to trust without understanding, believing that this man, the same man she had saved from death, now belonged first to God. There is a kind of silent pain that shapes the Lord's servants, and Zippora knew this pain well, that of fulfilling an essential role and then disappearing, that of being an instrument of salvation, but not the protagonist of the story. However, it is in this anonymity that greatness lies. God did not forget her, and at the right time, the reunion would happen, not as a romantic return, but as a symbol of restoration and purpose. Zipporah's reunion with Moses took place at a crucial moment, after the liberation from Egypt, when the people of Israel were already walking through the desert. Jethro, the wise father-in-law, brought Moses' wife and children with him, and that silent encounter marked more than a family reunion. It was a symbol of spiritual reconciliation. Zippora was reunited with the man she had once saved and then lost to a divine mission. The desert was once again the setting, but this time not for separation, but for restoration. Moses was no longer a fugitive or a man torn between two worlds. He was the prophet who had confronted Pharaoh, witnessed the sea part, and seen God act with power. And before him stood Zippora, the woman who, even in her absence, had been an essential part of it all. The Bible does not record any words between them. No dialogue, no emotions described, but the silence says enough. The reunion with Jethro and Zippora brought peace, reconciliation, and learning. It was as if God, after fulfilling the promise of deliverance, also restored what the call had wounded. Zippora, the foreigner, was once again inserted into the purpose, now as part of a priestly family connected to a people she had not understood before. Jethro's presence also has a deep spiritual meaning. Seeing what God had done for Moses and Israel, the Midianite priest declared, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods." Exodus 18:11. This confession sealed not only the faith of one man, but also the impact of Zipporah's life. Through her, her family came to know the true God. Zippora no longer needed to wield a rock or shed blood to fulfill her role. Her victory now lay in quiet restoration, in her reunited family, in her father-in-law worshipping the God of Israel, and in her husband finally complete in his mission. The reunion did not erase the pains of the past, but it gave them new meaning. Zipporah's silence, which had previously sounded like absence, now became a testimony of wisdom. Her story showed that love, when sustained by faith, is capable of crossing deserts and rediscovering purpose in God's timing. Little is known about Zipporah's last days, and perhaps it is precisely this silence that reveals the essence of her legacy. She did not end her story with great deeds or recorded words, but with a presence that crossed time, marked by obedience and courage. Her life was like a seed hidden in the desert, small in human eyes, but decisive in eternity. Zippora represented the strength of women who work behind the scenes of divine purpose. Without her, Moses would never have reached Egypt alive. Without her discernment and boldness, the deliverer of Israel would have been stopped before beginning his mission, and yet she never claimed recognition. Her faith was expressed in gestures, not speeches, in silent acts, not in the spotlight. Her reunion with Moses and the reconciliation of her family sealed her role in the history of redemption. Through her, the Midianites came into contact with the true God. And later, Jethro himself, Zipporah's priest and father, became Moses' advisor, helping to organize the people in the desert. Thus, Zipporah's lineage and wisdom influenced, albeit indirectly, the spiritual and administrative structure of Israel. Her name disappears from the following pages, but not her influence. Zipporah's silence echoes in the generations of women who sustain the faith without visibility, in the wives and mothers who intercede for weary prophets, and in the people who obey without fully understanding God's plan. Her legacy is one of quiet faithfulness, of courage that manifests itself when faith is tested in the dark. Perhaps she remained in Midian, or perhaps she walked with the people for a while. Scripture does not tell us. But her story ends in peace, surrounded by the certainty that she had fulfilled what heaven had entrusted to her. In the end, Zipporah shows us that true heroism is not in leading multitudes, but in being in the right place, at the right time, obeying the voice that speaks within. Her life was short in words, but immense in purpose, and to this day the blood she shed for love is still remembered as the beginning of the liberation of an entire people. Zipporah's story is one of those hidden gems in the pages of Scripture, short, discreet, and yet deeply revealing. It teaches us that God often performs the greatest miracles through silent gestures done far from the eyes of the world. Zipporah was not a prophetess, nor a warrior, nor a judge. She was just a woman who understood, at the right moment, what God required, and that was enough to change the course of history. While Moses represented the power and authority of the calling, Zipporah embodied the discernment and sensitivity of faith. When the liberator faltered, she acted. When the prophet collapsed, she kept the covenant alive. Her courage transformed a moment of death into a new beginning, and that is perhaps the most powerful lesson of her life. True faith does not depend on position, but on disposition. God used a foreign woman outside the lineage of Israel to preserve the covenant that would sustain the entire history of redemption. Through her, the Lord showed that His grace always transcends cultural, religious, and social boundaries. Zipporah was a reminder that God's purpose is not limited to those who have titles or visibility. It flourishes where there is an obedient heart. Spiritually, her story speaks to the value of readiness. How often, when faced with danger, do we prefer to wait for a sign or an explanation? Zipporah had neither. She had only the impulse of faith, and her seemingly small act saved a life and kept God's plan moving forward. She teaches us that faith is not made up of certainties, but of steps taken in the right direction, even without seeing the whole path. Finally, Zipporah reminds us that love and faith go hand in hand. She loved the man God had chosen, and out of love, she acted courageously. Her story is a mirror for all who serve in silence, sustaining ministries, families, and callings without human recognition. In the eyes of heaven, every act of faithfulness has eternal weight. Zipporah may have disappeared from the pages, but her legacy remains as a discreet flame that illuminates the backstage of faith. God still sees the gestures that no one notices, and still uses ordinary hands to fulfill extraordinary promises. If you enjoyed these curiosities and discoveries about Zippora, get ready. There are still many secrets hidden in the pages of the Bible that few know about. Enjoy this video, share it with those who love stories full of faith and mystery, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next surprising revelations about the great biblical characters. Together, we will discover the details that the Bible holds for those who seek a deeper understanding.